Close your eyes and take a deep breath. You are home now, and the world outside can wait. Welcome to another episode of Z in History. You probably know the name Dracula, but the real man behind the legend was worse than any vampire story could ever imagine. This is the story of Vlad Drăculea, a prince who learned as a child that mercy was a weakness and made an entire kingdom fear the sound of his name. So settle into a quiet room, let the lights grow low, and travel back to a world of stone fortresses and cold politics, where one man decided that being feared was better than being loved. Chapter 1. The Hostage. A small boy stood on a hill in 1442 and watched his father ride away. He was 5 years old, maybe 6. The exact number did not matter because he would not see his father again either way. His name was Vlad, but the Ottomans called him something else. They called him the hostage. His father had sent him to the Sultan's court as part of a deal, a promise of loyalty sealed with the safest hostage imaginable, a child. Vlad stood next to his younger brother, Radu, and tried very hard not to cry. The Ottoman court was not cruel in the way a child expected. Nobody beat him. Nobody starved him. They simply ignored him in a way that felt worse than punishment. He slept in a stone room with windows too high to see through. He ate alone. He learned Turkish because nobody would repeat themselves for a Wallachian boy who did not understand. Radu adjusted quickly. He was younger and softer, and the guards smiled at him. They brought him sweets. They taught him games. Radu learned to laugh in the palace, while Vlad learned to watch. There is a kind of education that happens when you sit in a room full of powerful people who do not know you exist. You see things that people who belong here never notice. Vlad watched the Sultan's advisors and learned to read the tilt of a head and the pause before an answer. He saw the way power really worked. It was not about strength. It was about knowing what someone feared before they knew it themselves. At night, he lay in the dark and worked through the logic of survival. The guards locked his door from the outside. The food came at the same time every day. The Sultan had not killed him yet, which meant Vlad was still useful. Usefulness was the only protection a hostage had. The moment you stopped being useful, you stopped being anything. The strange thing about growing up in a palace that is not yours is that you learn to feel safe without ever being safe. The walls are thick, the meals are warm, but the man who decides if you live or die is a stranger who has never once looked you in the eye. Vlad remembered that feeling for the rest of his life. The cold logic of having no protection except your own mind. He swore he would never feel it again, and he never did. Chapter 2. The Dragon's Son. Vlad left the Ottoman court in 1448 with a title and an army. He was 17 years old. The Sultan put him on the throne of Wallachia, because a puppet on your side of the border is always better than an enemy. Vlad rode into Targovik, the capital of his own country, and found a kingdom that barely remembered him. His father was dead. The old dragon had been murdered by the Bojars, the noble families who ran the country from behind the scenes. Vlad's older brother was dead too, buried alive by the same men who had sworn loyalty to his father. You might think that kind of betrayal would be rare, but in 15th century Wallachia, it was just how politics worked. If you wanted to stay alive, you needed people watching your back. Vlad had nobody. The Boyars did not take the new prince seriously. He was young. He had been raised by Turks. He spoke Turkish better than his own language. They assumed he would be easy to control, the kind of ruler who signed whatever papers you put in front of him and stayed out of the way. But a strange thing happens when you sit in a room full of powerful men who do not respect you. You learn things. Vlad sat on his father's throne and smiled at the nobles who knelt before him. He asked questions about the harvest. He nodded at their advice. He let them think they were in charge. What the Boyars did not know was that Vlad had spent years watching the most dangerous court in the world. He knew exactly how to smile at a man you planned to destroy. He knew that the best time to strike is when your enemy has stopped looking. He spent a few months on that first throne before the Ottomans pulled him off. It did not matter. He had seen how Wallachia worked, and he had made a list. The boyars who had buried his brother alive, the ones who had switched sides too quickly, the ones who laughed behind his back. He memorized every name. Chapter 3. The First Feast. In 1456, Vlad returned to Wallachia for the second time. He was 25 years old, and he was done being patient. He stormed Targovik with his own army and took the throne by force. The old prince who had replaced him fled. Vlad sat down in his father's chair and sent out invitations to a celebration. The boyars came. Of course they came. A new prince needed their support, and they needed to figure out how much they could squeeze out of him. They arrived at the castle, dressed in their finest robes, laughing with each other, already planning how they would run things while the young dragon played at being king. The feast was generous. The wine was good. The tables groaned under roasted meat and fresh bread, the kind of meal that made you forget that winter was coming. Vlad sat at the head of the table, quiet and watchful, while his guests ate and drank and talked too loudly about things they should not have said out loud. You have to understand the tension in that room. Every noble at that table knew someone who had served Vlad's father and then betrayed him. Some of them gave the order to bury Vlad's brother alive. They knew that the young prince probably knew, but they also knew that Wallachia had a long history of princes who knew things and did nothing about it. Power changed hands every few years. The boyars always survived. They always would. Near the end of the meal, Vlad stood up. The room went quiet. He asked a simple question. How many princes, he wanted to know, had ruled Wallachia in the last 100 years? The boyars exchanged glances. Someone answered, 23, give or take. Vlad nodded. And how many of them, he asked, died naturally in their sleep? Silence. The answer was 3 or 4. The rest had been murdered, poisoned, stabbed, strangled, thrown from windows. The boyars had been very busy over the years. Vlad smiled. Then he gave a signal, and armed men filled every doorway. The feast did not go as planned for the boyars of Wallachia. By the time the sun rose, the most powerful families in the kingdom were sitting in chains in the dungeon, trying to remember what they had done wrong. Vlad gave them one last chance. He asked for the names of the men who had killed his father and his brother. Some of them talked, most of them did not. He did not waste time with second chances. Chapter 4. The Easter Massacre. Easter Sunday in 1457 should have been a day of peace. The bells rang across Wallachia, and families, dressed in their best clothes and walked to church with their heads bowed and their minds on forgiveness. Vlad watched from the castle window and waited for the right moment. He had arrested the old Bojars at the feast, but there were hundreds more. The noble families were like roots, tangled deep into every village, every market, every decision that mattered. If Vlad wanted to rule Wallachia without being stabbed in the back, he needed to pull every single root out of the ground. He had a plan, and he had been waiting for Easter. The young prince arrived at the church with his guards. The congregation turned to look at him. Some of them smiled, some of them bowed. None of them knew they had already been sentenced. Vlad walked to the front of the church and stood next to the altar. He asked every noble family in attendance to join him outside. They came willingly, probably thinking he wanted to discuss taxes or land rights. By the time they realized something was wrong, the church doors had been locked behind them. There is a particular kind of confusion that happens when a person realizes too late that the trap was always there. The Bojars looked around. They saw soldiers carrying spears instead of Bibles. They saw Vlad standing in the courtyard with a face that did not belong at an Easter service. The youngest and oldest were separated from the rest. Vlad gave a simple order. The young ones would march to a fortress in the mountains. The old ones would stay. Nobody who stayed ever went home. The Easter Massacre, as it came to be known, was not a single day of killing. It was the beginning of a slow, deliberate destruction of a class of people who had tormented Wallachian princes for generations. Vlad did not just kill the boy. He took their land, their titles, their servants, everything they had built by betraying the men before him. By the end of that year, the old nobility of Wallachia barely existed. Vlad had removed an entire system of backroom politics the only way he knew how. He burned it down completely and started fresh. Here is the unexpected detail. In modern Romania, some historians argue that Vlad's brutality against the Bojars was a necessary step toward centralizing power. The old nobility had been bleeding the country dry for decades. Vlad did not hate them because of what they did to his family. He hated them because they made Wallachia weak. And a weak kingdom does not survive long when the Ottoman Empire is watching. Chapter 5. The Forest. In the summer of 1457, a merchant traveling through Wallachia saw something he would never forget. He had heard the rumors. Everyone had, but hearing about something and seeing it with your own eyes are two completely different things. The road passed through a forest outside town. The trees were old and thick, and the shade was welcome on a hot day. The merchant walked for maybe 10 minutes before he noticed the smell. He thought it was a dead animal at first. That happened sometimes on long roads, but the smell did not fade. It grew stronger. Then he saw the first one. It was a man, or rather the outline of a man, sitting on a wooden pole that had been driven straight through his body and out the top of his shoulder. The pole was maybe 12 feet tall. The man had been alive when they put him on it. You could tell from the position of his hands and the way he had tried to pull himself up. The merchant stopped walking. Then he saw the second one, and the third, and then he realized that the entire forest was full of them. This was the first mass impalement ordered by Vlad Drăculea. The men on those poles were the Bojars he had arrested at the Easter Massacre. Vlad had chosen this punishment for a very specific reason. Impalement was not just about killing someone. It was about sending a message that nobody in the country could ignore. Here is how it worked. The victim was tied to a horse. A wooden pole, rounded at one end and sharpened at the other, was carefully inserted into the body. The horse was then led forward, and gravity did the rest. The pole traveled slowly through the body, pushed by the weight of the victim, sometimes taking hours or even days to finish the job. The modern reaction to this kind of cruelty is immediate horror, but in Vlad's world, the calculation was different. He did not have a large army. He did not have endless gold. What he had was a reputation, and a reputation could do the work of 1,000 soldiers. If you maintained it properly, Bud watched the forest from the castle walls. He did not smile. He did not look away. He simply noted the effect. Reports came back that traders were avoiding Wallachia. Peasants were staying inside. Enemies were thinking twice. The reputation was working. There is a strange kind of quiet that falls over a country when the ruler is genuinely terrifying. People stop arguing about small things. They stop plotting. They stop doing anything that might draw attention. Vlad understood this better than most. He did not want to be loved. He wanted to be left alone to rule his country the way he saw fit. The forest became a landmark. Travelers told stories about it. Envoys reported what they saw. Vlad's reputation spread beyond the borders of Wallachia, into Hungary, into Poland, into the heart of the Ottoman Empire itself. And that was exactly what he wanted. Chapter 6. The Sultan's demand. Mehmed II had conquered Constantinople when he was 21 years old. He was the most powerful man in the known world, the ruler of an empire that stretched from the Danube to the Euphrates. When he demanded tribute from Wallachia, he expected Vlad to pay dot. The tribute was the usual arrangement: gold, grain, soldiers, and 1,000 young boys sent to the Ottoman court to be trained as generals. Every Christian kingdom under Ottoman influence paid this price. It was the cost of existing next to an empire that could crush you at any moment. Vlad said no. He did not send a letter of apology. He did not offer a counter-proposal. He simply refused. And when the Sultan sent 2 envoys to Targovik to collect the tribute in person, Vlad received them in his throne room. The envoys were experienced diplomats. They had traveled to dozens of courts across Europe and Asia. They knew how to handle difficult rulers. They entered with their heads high and their turbans on, as was their custom. They expected a negotiation. Vlad looked at them from his throne. He asked why they had not removed their headwear in the presence of a Christian prince. The envoys explained that it was against their custom. Vlad considered this for a moment. He said he would help them respect custom permanently. He ordered his guards to nail the turbans to their heads, through the cloth, through the fabric, into the skull. The envoys died on the floor of the throne room, and Vlad sent their bodies back to Constantinople as his official reply. You have to admire the theatricality of the move, even as it horrifies you. Vlad knew that any number of men could have refused the tribute and been ignored. A refusal was just words. But a nailed turban was a statement that nobody in Constantinople would misunderstand. Mehmed was reportedly furious, but he was also curious. Who was this Wallachian prince who had the audacity to insult the conqueror of Constantinople? He sent a larger force to bring Vlad to heel. It failed. The war between Vlad and the Ottoman Empire had begun. It was not a war Wallachia could win, but it would be a war the Ottomans would never forget. Here is the unexpected historical detail. Vlad's refusal to send 1,000 boys to the Janissary Corps was personal. He had been one of those boys. He had sat in the Ottoman court and learned their language and watched their games, while his brother Radu laughed with the guards. He knew exactly what happened to those boys. Some became soldiers, some became slaves, and a very few, like Radu, became something worse. They became loyal to the empire that stole them. Vlad would not let that happen to another generation of Wallachian children, even if it meant starting a war he could not win. Chapter 7. The Night Attack. The year was 1462. The Ottoman army had crossed the Danube. Mehmed II was coming personally, leading a force that historians estimate at somewhere between 60,000 and 150,000 men. Wallachia had maybe 10,000 soldiers at best. On paper, this was not a war. It was an execution. Vlad did not hide behind his castle walls. He did not send desperate letters to the Pope. He did the one thing nobody expected. He attacked first. The night attack happened on June 17, 1462, just south of Targovic. Vlad took his entire army, roughly 7,000 men, and marched them through the forest in complete darkness. They moved without torches, without drums, without a single sound that would carry across a camp. They knew the land. The Ottomans did not dot. The Ottoman camp stretched for miles. Tents for the Sultan, tents for the generals, tents for the soldiers who had conquered the greatest city in the Christian world. They were not expecting an attack. Wallachia was supposed to surrender. Vlad's men struck in the middle of the night. They came out of the darkness with swords and torches, cutting tent ropes and killing soldiers before they could reach their weapons. The camp erupted into chaos. Horses bolted. Tents collapsed. Fires spread. In the confusion, Ottoman soldiers killed their own men. Unable to tell friend from enemy in the dark, Vlad's target was the Sultan's tent. If he could kill Mehmed in the chaos, the entire campaign would collapse. His forces pushed deep into the camp, past the outer guards, past the inner ring, all the way to the heart of the Ottoman command. They nearly succeeded. Mehmed was woken by the sounds of battle and barely escaped with his life. His guards held the line long enough for the Sultan to retreat, and Vlad was forced to pull back before his small army was surrounded. The Ottomans lost thousands that night. Vlad lost almost nobody. In military terms, the night attack was a stunning success, but it did not win the war. Mehmed was shaken, but he was not beaten. He regrouped, reorganized, and pressed forward into Wallachia. Vlad had only one weapon left, and it was the most terrifying one he had. Chapter 8. The Forest of the Impaled. Mehmed II had seen war. He had seen sieges and battles and the aftermath of conquest. He had watched Constantinople fall and ordered the execution of thousands. Nothing in his experience prepared him for what he saw outside Targovic. The road to the capital passed through a valley. The valley was about a kilometer wide. It was also completely filled with impaled bodies. Not dozens, not hundreds. 20,000 of them, arranged in rows that stretched as far as the eye could see. Ottoman soldiers, Turkish prisoners, captured spies, and enemy collaborators, all in various stages of death on wooden poles of different heights. The Sultan stopped his army and stared. This was Vlad's final message. He could not match the Ottomans in numbers. He could not match them in equipment. But he could show them exactly what kind of man they were fighting. The Forest of the Impaled was not just a display of cruelty, it was a calculated piece of psychological warfare. The Ottomans broke ranks, not the soldiers at the front who were trained to hold, but the men at the back who heard the descriptions from the scouts and decided they had no interest in meeting the Wallachian prince in person. Veteran warriors who had fought across 3 continents refused to advance. They had seen death before. They had never seen anything like this. Mihech reportedly said something that translates roughly to this: "A man who does such things is not worth fighting. He is not a prince. He is a devil." The Sultan turned his army around and marched back to Constantinople. He did not conquer Wallachia that year, but here is the strange truth. Vlad's greatest victory was also the beginning of his end. The Forest of the Impaled saved Wallachia, but it also destroyed Vlad's reputation beyond repair. Europe called him a monster. The Pope withdrew support. The Hungarian king, who had been an ally, began to see Vlad as a threat, rather than a useful neighbor. The same terror that protected Wallachia from the Ottomans made Vlad impossible to trust. The unexpected detail is that nobody knows if the impalement of 20,000 was real or exaggerated. The numbers come from Ottoman and European sources who had every reason to inflate the horror. The truth might be somewhere between 10,000 and 20,000. Either way, it was enough. Chapter 9: The Betrayal. Radu the Handsome had spent the same years in the Ottoman court as his brother. But where Vlad learned to hate, Radu learned to belong. The guards brought him sweets. The Tudors praised his grace. The Sultan himself found the young Wallachian boy charming and useful. When the war came, the Ottomans gave Radu an army and a title, and sent him to take Wallachia for himself. Radu did not just march against his brother. He campaigned door to door, village by village, telling the Wallachian people that he would be a kinder ruler. No impalement, no forests of the dead, just peace under Ottoman protection. The people listened. They were terrified of Vlad. The same fear that held them together in wartime became a poison in peacetime. Nobody wanted to live under a ruler who might impale them for missing a tax payment. Radu offered safety. It was an easy choice. Vlad watched his kingdom slip away, piece by piece. The villages that had celebrated him as a defender of Christendom now closed their gates when his army approached. The nobles who had sworn loyalty to him after the Easter Massacre began whispering to Radu's agents. Even the priests, who should have been his strongest supporters, quietly prayed for a different prince. There is a particular kind of loneliness that comes when you realize that your own people have chosen your enemy. Vlad had done everything he thought a ruler should do. He had crushed the corrupt nobles. He had defended the country against invasion. He had built a reputation that made even the Sultan pause. And none of it mattered. The people wanted a ruler who was kind, not a ruler who was strong. Radu took Targovekt without a siege. The gates opened for him. Vlad retreated to his mountain fortress with a handful of loyal men and watched the capital he had fought for turn against him. He stayed long enough to see his wife die, reportedly by her own hand rather than risk capture. Then he escaped through a secret passage and disappeared into the mountains. The betrayal was not the worst part. The worst part was understanding that it made perfect sense. Vlad had ruled through fear, and fear works until someone offers a way out. Radu offered the way out. The people took it. Chapter 10: The Fall. Vlad did not run to safety. He ran to Hungary, hoping to convince King Matthias Corvinus to help him retake his throne. Matthias was a Christian king who had fought the Ottomans before. He seemed like the obvious ally for a man who had just spent years bleeding the Turkish army. But Matthias had met the envoys from Rome. He had heard the stories about the Forest of the Impaled. He had received letters from the Pope suggesting that Vlad was not a crusader, but a madman who brought shame to Christianity. And Matthias was a practical man. He made a practical decision. He arrested Vlad and threw him into prison. Vlad spent 12 years in a Hungarian cell. Not a dungeon exactly, but close enough. He had a room with windows and a bed and servants who brought meals. But the doors were locked, and the guards did not care who he was, and the world moved on without him. You have to imagine what those years were like for a man who had never stopped moving. Vlad had spent his entire life fighting, planning, watching, calculating. He had conquered a kingdom and defied an empire. Now he sat in a stone room and listened to the rain. His brother, Radu, ruled Wallachia under Ottoman protection. The country was peaceful. The impalings stopped. The people who had feared Vlad for a decade learned to relax. Some of them probably forgot him entirely. Vlad did not become kind in prison. He did not find God or discover the value of forgiveness. He sat in his cell and he waited. He had learned patience as a hostage in the Ottoman court, and he learned it again now. He watched the guards change shifts. He counted the seasons. He waited for his chance. The unexpected historical detail is that Vlad may not have been entirely idle. Sources suggest he wrote during his imprisonment. Letters, treatises, poems. He was educated, fluent in several languages, and capable of the kind of cold, analytical thinking that makes for good writing. None of it survived, but it changes the image slightly. The monster in the cell was also a man who put his thoughts on paper. Chapter 11: The Return. In 1474, King Matthias Corvinus decided he needed Vlad again. The Ottomans were pressing into Hungary. The alliance with Radu had broken down, and Matthias had run out of better options. He released Vlad from prison and gave him an army. Vlad was in his 40s now. The man who rode back into Wallachia was not the same man who had stormed the Ottoman camp 12 years earlier. He was older, heavier. His hands shook sometimes. But he had not forgotten how to be terrifying. The campaign was short and brutal. Vlad retook his throne without the elaborate planning of his youth. He simply marched in and started killing. The walls did not need to be climbed when the gate guards were too afraid to resist. But something had changed. The people did not fear Vlad the way they once did. 12 years of peace under Radu had dulled the terror. The stories about the Forest of the Impaled had become campfire tales, not living memory. A new generation had grown up who did not remember the Easter Massacre or the Road of Poles. Vlad tried to rule the same way he always had. He executed traitors. He sent threatening letters to the Ottomans. He made examples of anyone who crossed him. But the machinery of terror requires constant maintenance, and Vlad had lost 12 years of maintenance time. His reputation had rusted. The Ottoman response came quickly. They did not send Mehdi this time. They sent an army under a commander who had studied Vlad's tactics and prepared countermeasures. Vlad's tricks did not work twice. The ambushes failed. The night attacks were expected. The impalements no longer shocked anyone who had grown up hearing about them. Vlad fought his last battle on a muddy field near Bucharest in late 1476. He did not retreat. He did not surrender. He fought until he was surrounded, and then he disappeared into the chaos. Nobody knows exactly who killed him. Chapter 12. The Legend. Vlad's body was never properly buried. His head was cut off, preserved in honey, and sent to Constantinople as a trophy. It ended up displayed on a spike outside the Sultan's palace, a final irony for a man who had used spikes as his signature. The head stayed there for years, slowly rotting, until someone finally took it down and threw it away. Wallachia went back to being a small, struggling principality on the edge of the Ottoman Empire. New princes came and went, most of them forgotten within a generation. Vlad became a footnote in Eastern European history, remembered mostly by peasants who told stories about the cruel prince who turned forests into graveyards. Then, in 1897, an Irish novelist named Bram Stoker published a book called Dracula. He had been researching Eastern European folklore and found a footnote that mentioned a Wallachian prince named Dracula, which meant son of the dragon or son of the devil, depending on which language you used. Stoker had never been to Romania. His knowledge of Vlad was limited to a few paragraphs in a history book. But the name caught his imagination. Stoker's Dracula was a vampire, an undead creature who drank blood and slept in a coffin and could turn into a bat. None of this had anything to do with the real Vlad. The real Vlad did not drink blood. He did not sleep in a coffin. He did not turn into anything. He was just a man who made terrible choices in a terrible time and became something he probably never intended to be. But the novel became a sensation. It spawned plays and movies and television shows and Halloween costumes and breakfast cereal and an entire industry of vampire fiction that shows no signs of stopping. Every adaptation made Dracula more monstrous and less human. The Vlad of Bram Stoker's imagination became one of the most recognizable characters in the world. And the real Vlad, the 5-year-old boy who stood on a hill and watched his father ride away. The teenager who learned to survive in a palace that hated him. The prince who impaled 20,000 men and then spent 12 years alone in a stone cell. That Vlad was reduced to a footnote. A monster in a cape. A Halloween decoration. The truth is that the real Dracula was worse than the vampire, but also more human. He was not a supernatural creature who fed on the living. He was a man who decided at 5 years old that he would never be helpless again. And he kept that promise until the day he died, which might be even scarier than the stories.